Mike, thank you.
Well, Marvin, thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to talk today. These are some of my TAVR conflicts of interest. I've had the opportunity to run a number of the trials out there. But my other conflict of interest, and my slides aren't showing up for some reason. Am I a cardiac surgeon? Am I going to run this, or y'all going to run it? Okay, so we'll start. There were two low-risk randomized trials that are very important. There was the Partner trial, Partner 3 trial, and the Evolute low-risk trial. They were different trials. They had different endpoints. The Partner trial, remember, had a composite endpoint of all-cause mortality, all stroke, or hospitalization, and it was positive for TAVR. The Evolute trial, we decided to be a little more conservative, had an endpoint of all-cause mortality or disabling stroke, and a 2-year endpoint using a Bayesian analysis. I did that a little bit early, and it was strongly non-inferior. So this got approved for low risk. So what did we see in the early data? Well, in the early data, what we see is that the operative risk for TAVR was about 1/3 that of surgery. So it was lower at the procedure and it was lower at one risk. So TAVR has less upfront risk for mortality. We also saw that it had less risk for stroke. In the early trials, Partner high risk had a higher stroke rate. That's why when Hartzell Schaff wrote the editorial about it, he said success, but at what price? But every trial since then, TAVR has had a lower stroke rate. So lower mortality, lower stroke rate, and lower hospitalization. So where does that go from the first year? Well, this is now the 6-year data from the Evolute low-risk trial for the primary endpoint of all-cause mortality, disabling stroke. And what you can see is that they finally touched it about 5.5 years. But again, they're basically parallel lines, statistically no difference whatsoever. So then we break that down into the components of the primary endpoint, and that is all-cause mortality, disabling stroke. And you see disabling stroke is flat. And then all-cause mortality, although it swayed in favor of TAVR for a couple of years, it's kind of come back. We see these curves wobble, but at 6 years, there's no difference in mortality. So it's holding up fairly well. If we look at cardiovascular mortality and non-cardiovascular mortality has to do with how sick you are to begin with. Cardiovascular, how well you repair your valve and how well the valve works. And we see that there's no real difference at 6 years. And if we take out the risk of surgery by landmarking at 1 year, again, no difference at 6 years. So far we're doing pretty well. But then we got here and we said all of a sudden we see the reintervention rate starting to splay apart. And if we use a cumulative incidence, it's about 0.07. Wasn't statistically significant using cumulative incidence. But when I saw this, I pushed my trying to give me what 7-year data we had, which is about 80% of the people, and it spread even further. So it became statistically significant, something that we're going to watch very carefully as we move forward. Now we move over to the Partner 3 trial. Remember, the primary endpoint was all-cause mortality, all stroke or hospitalization, initially superior. Now these lines have come together. They're no different, but they're no longer superior. If we look at all-cause death, we see it crosses at about 3 years. But again, even though it's crossed, statistically there's no difference at 7 years. The CV death and non-CV death, although it's still higher for TAVR than surgery, from a statistical standpoint, no difference. All stroke started off positive, but now it's the same, so no difference. Aortic reintervention started to display a little bit, but no difference at 7 years. So far we're looking pretty good, but this to me as a surgeon is still just midterm data. We do have some 10-year data from the Notion trial, the Nordic country trial. That was Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Belgium. It was the original core valve versus surgery, kind of a low intermediate risk mix of people, no difference in mortality at 10 years. So we do have some 10-year randomized data. We have 3 valves that are available commercially in the U.S. for TAVR. We have the core valve, Evolute FX Plus, our current version of the valve. We have the Sapien Ultra valve, and we have the Navitor valve for high risk only. We're in the midst of running the Envision trial for low and intermediate risk. That trial is about a little over half full right now. And that's led to our current guidelines. Our current guidelines say if you're 65 or less, or going to live 20 years or more, you should still have surgery. If you're 80 or you live 10 years or less, you should have TAVR. 65 to 80, it's the physiologic risk of surgery, the anatomic risk of TAVR, and what the patients want. And this is what's happened. The blue line that you see going up is all TAVRs. This is up to 2024. We had over 100,000 commercial TAVRs. We don't have all the data for 2025 yet, but it's going to be closer to 118,000 TAVRs. The red line is all aortic valve procedures combined, and the green line you see down there is isolated aortic valves. So you see TAVRs eclipsed all the surgical valves that we do, and it's not going to go back. Now, one thing that's out there that's a little worrisome is that, remember, our guidelines say if you're 65 or less, you should have surgery. But what we see from the Vizient database is that those less than 65 in the Vizient database that are less than 65, almost half of them are getting TAVR right now. So it is going to be interesting to see as we move forward, since we've moved to such younger ages already. We all have some things from Europe. This is the Dedicate from the German trial. Dedicate was a low and intermediate risk trial, and what we found out that surgery had a much higher mortality rate at 1 year than TAVR. And if we move forward and we look at stroke, higher in surgery than TAVR. So one of the complaints was that the mortality in the German trial was about 6%, which was much higher than anybody expected. But again, this was more of a real-world group of German surgeons rather than heavily selected sites. And again, if you look at the forest plot of this, it favored TAVR up and down. So that's led to the European. The European used to say that if you were less than 75 and low risk, you had surgery. Over 75, you have TAVR. They've now moved that age down to 70. So they're moving closer to what the U.S. guidelines are. Now, one of the real questions, though, is as we think about lifetime management, is how long are your patients going to live? So this is from the Sweetheart database. The Sweetheart database in Sweden is a database where everybody that has TAVR surgery is databased as they come, and we know how many people live because they're all linked by law to a number, and we have about 100% follow-up. So they took everybody that was 60 over, having an isolated aortic valve, they have 100% follow-up, and they divided them up into people that were high risk, the black line, intermediate risk, the red line, or low risk, the blue line. And I've drawn a line at 10 years because I think we have 10-year data for durability so far. And what you see is these are the mean survivals, and only intermediate risk that starts at age 70 bumps up to a 10-year intermediate survival. But we see this have as large list if you're low risk and you're between 60 and 75 when you get your original TAVR, you may live more than 10 years, and we don't have the data on that yet. So these are our current guidelines as we lose in our lifetime planning. Now, the other thing to remember is that randomized trials only apply to populations similar to those that were tested. So who wasn't included in the low-risk trials? Well, we didn't test bicuspid valves. We did no significant coronary disease. We didn't take anybody that had unfavorable anatomy. Remember in the PARTNER 3 trial, although everybody was approved by a local heart team as having favorable anatomy, 34% were turned down nationally. Why? Because the anatomy wasn't very good for TAVR. So these were highly selected trials, and you could not have associated procedures, and anybody appropriate for a mechanical valve was not done. Now, we're starting a trial right now. This is Raj Makkar's running this trial called the Believers Trial. We've been trying to get a randomized bicuspid trial going for a while. Dr. Kleiman and I are part of this trial. And there's a second trial called Navigate that Steve Windecker will be running in Europe. So hopefully we're going to have some actual randomized data. I was meeting with Joe Chikwi as we were putting together this protocol at the AATS, and they were talking about having a national screening committee decide who should be done based on anatomy. And I said, no, we should let the sites choose because that's real world. If we screen out everybody that's bad anatomy, we're not going to have a real world trial. Now, there's two new balloon expandable valves that are coming along that are pretty exciting. The trials have started. This is the Siegel valve by Mirus. It's made with a frame out of rhenium, which is further down the periodic table, and has no nickel in it. Nickel's in almost everything you can think of, but there's no nickel in rhenium. And the interesting thing is that instead of diamonds which shorten, it has squares with bars on it, so it doesn't shorten at all. It goes straight out, and it has a lot of tensile strength because of the metal that's in it. And it's going to go through an 8-French delivery system, an 8-French expandable delivery system. And this trial is ongoing right now. They do have some EFS baseline stuff. The baseline EFS data was really very good. No mortality at 30 days, no stroke at 30 days, very low pacemaker rate. Interesting hemodynamics. For this balloon expandable valve, the hemodynamics seem to be matching that of self-expanding valves. And what's interesting, when you watch these things expand, you watch it will not shorten at all. It goes straight out because of the design of the valve. So you have a very, very strong valve. And the other thing about this valve is it has so much strength that it's always round. And under expansion of these TAVR valves, I think, is a big problem that we've paid not enough attention to. And this valve really does go out. And it's now in a trial called the STAR trial. Now, we're not part of the STAR trial because they insisted you could be in only their trial, and we're in another trial. This is the DuraValve trial from Anteris. It's got a cobalt chromium frame, and it's got this adapt tissue, and it comes from a single piece that's molded to look like your valve. And it's going to have a delivery system which allows us to rotate for commissural alignment, not by rotating the handle, but rotate just above the valve. We've run an EFS study. This is out. We've published this. Mean age is about 77. These were all small valves. These would have fit into the SMART trial by Evolute. The area was less than 400. And in this, we had no mortality, no strokes, a very low pacemaker rate. And hemodynamics, again, they look very similar to the self-expanding valve. So we now have 2 new balloon expandable valves that are being tried, which have very low patient prosthetic mismatch rates, really excellent hemodynamics, look very similar to what we saw from the self-expanding valve in the SMART trial. And interestingly enough, when you put this in 4D CMR, you get laminar flow. You don't get laminar flow from most of the valves. You certainly don't get it out of surgical stented valves. But a native valve, a Ross, and this valve all tend to have laminar flow, and laminar flow saves energy. The Paradigm trial is ongoing. We're part of this. It'll be an all-comers trial, a high, intermediate, low-risk trial, randomized against surgery. There'll be a valve and valve, and there'll be a valve and VAD for this. Aortic insufficiency, there are 2 valves now for aortic insufficiency, the Jenna valve and the J valve. We were part of both these trials. The Trilogy valve from Jenna, it has these feet that are fairly very pointed. They go down in your commissures. They line the valve up. In AI, the issue is they always go into the ventricle. These feet line the valve up and keep it from going in the ventricle. The hemodynamics on these are excellent. The mean valve areas are about 2.4, 2.5. The hemodynamics are all low single digits. And right now, the Jenna valve, the Align trial for high risk is finished. That valve is approved commercially for high risk. And now we're in part of the ARTIS trial. ARTIS will be a randomized trial for low and intermediate risk, Jenna versus surgery. We've enrolled our first couple patients, and this trial is going on right now. The J valve was originally a company from China. It was now bought by Edwards. Edwards is now running this trial. We were part of running the EFS trial for this. And in the EFS, we had no mortality, no stroke, no residual PVL, and no permanent pacemakers. We're now doing the Journey trial. Dean Kiriakis and I ran the EFS. We'll now be the chairs for the Journey trial. Yoshi Kaneko and Santiago Garcia will be the PIs. This will be for high-risk aortic regurgitation. And again, this would be a single-arm trial for treating AR. Again, I want to keep us on our 7 minutes, so I'm going to go fairly quickly through this. But remember now, if we look at surgery, surgery is still something we do a lot of. It's still very important. It is part of the lifetime management, whether we think about it or not. And when we go through shared decision-making, if we start thinking about the aortic valve replacement, whether it be by surgery or transcatheter, still less than 50, you're probably going to have surgery unless there's something wrong with you, and we still do a Ross or a mechanical valve. 60 to 65, now we're talking mechanical or tissue valve, or as you get past 65, we're talking about biologic valves or TAVR. If we look at surgical choices, we can choose a mechanical valve, a Ross procedure, a supported Ross, a stented biologic valve with a root enlargement, and stentless biologic roots. Now, it's very important when we look at this, there's no real difference between 50 and 65 years old between the survival between a biologic valve and a mechanical valve. What you're trading off is the risk of reoperation with the biologic valve versus the risk of bleeding with a mechanical valve, but no difference in survival. What's really important is there's been a recurrence of the Ross procedure. Ross procedures, we take your pulmonary root out, we move it over to the aorta, we put an allograft in your root. It is the only operation for aortic stenosis that returns you to a full normal lifespan. No other operation we do, whether it's a stented surgical valve, TAVR valve, returns you to a normal span of life. Only the Ross, because it puts a normal valve in there. Any other valve we use leaves you with some residual stenosis. And again, we've seen all this. Now, the other thing that we talk about is in our lifetime is if we have a TAVR valve and it fails, what are we going to do? Now, sometimes I can put another TAVR valve in there. About 50% of the time I can't. And there's been a lot of data that if we have to explant these valves, it has a higher risk than just doing a redo surgical valve. So we've looked at the 60 that we've done that were part of this. And what we found is if you were in low risk, you're the blue line, high risk, you're the green line. And the survival tends to be fairly good. But most importantly, we divided this in half. The first half of these we did between 2015 and 2022, 27 of them, and the second half between 2023 and 2025. And what we see is the mortality has come down drastically. This is a new operation. It's like any new operation. The surgeons have had to learn how to do this. And I think as time goes on, although it'll be a little more complex in redo surgery, the mortality is not going to be much different. And I'm going to stop there because I've probably run past my 7 minutes, but I'm happy to answer any questions you have.